Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin Wilt. I'm Brighton Town board member and also candidate for Congress in New York's 25th Congressional District. I want to thank you for joining us today for another one of our COVID-19 community check-ins and updates.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin.
These are updates in which we highlight the issues facing our frontline and most vulnerable community members to raise awareness and build action around moving forward through this pandemic together with hopefully no one left behind. Today, we're going to focus on voting rights in the age of COVID-19. The right of every person to vote is fundamental to American society and to our democracy. Voting is literally the right that we exercise to protect all other rights. It must be protected, expanded, and voters must be engaged and informed. Now, despite its progressive reputation, New York State has long had some of the most arcane and restrictive voting laws in the country. Unlike 37 other states, New York until very recently had no early voting. Unlike 27 other states, New York still requires people seeking an absentee ballot to provide an excuse under penalty of perjury for why they will not be present on Election Day. Unlike 15 other states, New York doesn't have Election Day registration. And unlike 14 states, New York doesn't have automatic voter registration. Last year, however, the Democratic-controlled state legislature passed a sweeping election reform package that includes early voting and pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. That's the good news. The legislation also gives initial authorization to constitutional amendments to enact Election Day registration and no excuse absentee voting. These items remain to be approved by voters at a later date, although Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo has pledged to sign the bills. In addition, by executive order, Governor Cuomo also restored the rights of parolees to vote. Now, other ways in which voting is inaccessible in New York is our confusing registration deadlines and outmoded poll books, which cause errors, delays, and long lines. And just as an example, I have the calendar of dates and deadlines for New York State in our presidential primary, which of course has been delayed from April 28th until June 23rd. Now, to make matters worse, due to decades of partisan gerrymandering, New Yorkers can't be sure they'll receive equal representation even when they do cast their ballots. The New York Civil Liberties Union has been a leader in the fight to actualize and protect every citizen's ability to exercise the basic constitutional right to vote in New York State. Today, we're joined by Iman Abid and Ashley Gant, both from the Genesee Valley Regional Office of the New York Civil Liberties Union. And because they won't say it, I just want to recognize that these are two really badass organizers who are highly regarded in our community. And I want to say I feel really honored and grateful to have them here today with us. They're both recognized on a number of levels. So first of all, I want to welcome you both, Ashley and Iman, and give you a chance to join our conversation today. Just start out by taking this opportunity to introduce yourselves in greater detail and tell us more about your community involvement. And we'll start out with Iman.
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I'm really humbled to be besides you and the other amazing organizers for doing this awesome work. So just a really quick introduction. My name is Iman. I am a Rochester native. Born and raised here. I went to RIT, originally was really interested in political organizing, of which I got the opportunity to do for a couple of years, fell in love with it, and it actually led me to an opportunity with the ACLU about 4.5 years ago, originally as a community organizer. So really getting the opportunity to be in the community and work with people who were directly impacted by issues around civil liberties and civil rights violations. And then 2 years after being an organizer, becoming the regional director for the chapter. So 4.5 years of bliss. I've been really enjoying the work. I think it's something that's absolutely necessary. I mean, we're one of the longest standing nonprofits, so it's wonderful to just be with such a sustainable organization that's really dedicated to fighting for people's civil liberties and civil rights. And thank you for asking me to join today.
Well, thank you again for being here, and thank you for everything you do in our community. You just touched on a few things that the New York Civil Liberties Union is active in our community, but thank you for protecting our rights. And now I'll have Ashley introduce herself.
Hi, so my name is Ashley, and I've been an organizer for probably the last 10 years. I work really keenly on criminal justice work and racial justice work. I am new to the Civil Liberties Union. I've been here almost 10 months. But previously in my extra time, I worked on campaigns and running candidates for offices like Senate, Judge, Congress, etc. So thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and get into the conversation.
Excellent, excellent. And we will get right into it. As I mentioned in my introduction, New York State has only recently implemented early voting. And early voting occurred for the first time in our state just last election cycle, the local election cycle on November 3rd. The Monroe County hosted only 7 early voting sites, and that was the minimum under state law that created the early voting statute. And only one of those sites was located within the city of Rochester, which is, of course, a community of over 200,000 residents. Monroe County Democrats had earlier proposed increasing that number to 15, but they were turned down. Do you know if more early voting locations are planned for this presidential primary election on June 23rd or in future elections that we have upcoming?
I wish I could give a more direct answer. I actually do not know just yet, but that is something that we're hoping that, I mean, unfortunately, with all these issues on top of with COVID and whatnot, we're going to see a whole new environment that we'll have to deal with this new election coming up. So we're hoping that, you know, the polling sites can be accessible enough to ensure that people do turn out to vote if they can, and not necessarily have to go out of their ways to get to where they need to go and have it become more accessible. So that is a conversation we'll continue to have with the Board of Elections commissioners, as well as the Monroe County executive, just to see what's going on with that.
All right, thank you, thank you. Yeah, you mentioned, you know, it's so important that our polling sites be accessible. It's so important that they're within all parts of our community, because what we saw last election cycle, unfortunately, is that some people had barriers to access, and that's something that we must always protect. And in particular during this pandemic, when we are missing some of our normal ways to interact, it's really important that we safeguard, you know, our rights to vote. And I always like to point out that a lot of the crises that we've been highlighting during these discussions are, you know, problems that existed long before coronavirus reared its head. And the pandemic simply exacerbates a lot of the existing problems. At the same time, it also presents an opportunity to highlight these issues and address them while everyone is focused on some of the areas in which we're missing adequate fail-safes within our systems. This year, of course, marks the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which promised the right of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Yet since 2008, when pre-clearance was struck down by the Supreme Court, states across the country have passed additional measures that make it harder for Americans, particularly Black Americans, the elderly, students, and people with disabilities to exercise their fundamental right to cast a ballot. And some of the things we've been seeing is cuts to early voting, increases in voter ID laws, purges of voting rolls, and gerrymandering and poll closures. Now, we've seen just in these past few weeks that representatives in both Georgia and Wisconsin, and recently the President of the United States described increased voter turnout as a threat. And these representatives openly admit that voter suppression is used as a tool to ensure underrepresentation in certain communities. Can you give us a little bit of the history and describe the current state of voting rights in the United States before the pandemic ever hit? What threats to our voting rights have been posed?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer. I don't know, Ashley, if you would like to start off. No. No, I think I go. Okay. So I think like I'll start out by speaking regionally, just as far as like the historical issues we've seen here. I mean, I'm glad that you touched on the issue of accessibility. Unfortunately, that's just been a historic issue we've had here, whether it's access to people's proper polling sites, people getting like inaccurate information sent to them, and not necessarily following through on that before election day. That's happened here historically. And we've had these, and all of this has been brought forth to the Board of Elections attention in the past. There's a conversation around election intimidation, people being turned away from their election sites, being told that they're not their sites when in reality they are, not being given affidavit ballots, the rides to polls, the inaccessibility with like transportation inequity. That's been a huge issue that we've had. And I know that the city has tried, especially with like rides to polls and whatnot, but not at the rate that we're hoping that these things could happen by in order to increase voter turnout, which is not a threat to democracy, but rather the epitome of what democracy actually entails. And so, we've seen all of those issues, and there's the issue around like the actual physical accessibility, right? Like there are some very older, older, I'm sorry, something's going on.
We can still see you.
Oh, great. Okay. There's an Adobe update that happened right now.
The
physical accessibility, especially for people who are disabled, who may need the alternative venues to get alternative avenues to get into buildings and whatnot, and to get out of buildings. We're not up to par as a county when it comes to things like that. And we've been asking for those things for long before COVID. So you're absolutely right. This pandemic has just exacerbated everything that we've already been dealing with. So whether it's an increase in accessible polling sites, transportation inequities, making sure that people have right now, especially having the opportunity to vote from home, not necessarily having to put their health at risk by attending, going into a polling site, or if it's the expansion of early voting, making sure that people turn out at separate times in different periods and different cycles to reduce the amount of people who are interacting with one another. Now, I think that we're a little behind when it comes to that. The county hasn't necessarily put forth a plan. I haven't seen anything. And historically, again, this is something that we've been asking for years before. This is exactly why the election package was voted on last year in the New York State Legislature. There was a lot more that we asked for that wasn't, passed. There's a lot that's also that needs to be done. That can't be done through legislation, but has to be done through constitutional amendments and possible litigation. So there's all of this that's ongoing right now, but it's all the more important to just put the emphasis on just why we need to prepare beforehand, and even long before this pandemic, why these were all issues. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is that when it comes to like the comment you made about that this is like a concept, like this is a public health issue. There's nothing that we're dealing with right now that isn't a public health issue, but it's all the more reason to not necessarily deter people away from what's going on, but rather identifying ways in which we can alternate and revise things that we need to get done. So when it comes to voter suppression, I mean, our president necessarily hasn't been of support to higher turnout. Of course, that's why we saw so many tactics being used in southern states to further suppress voters. And there are tactics being used in other places as well, whether it's like defunding certain programs, whether it's, eliminating certain programs. And that is not what we need right now, especially in a year where we're, getting census data that will really impact the election districts in the future, making sure that we have the proper leadership in place locally so we can redistrict and not necessarily have the gerrymandering that we've dealt with for the last 10 years.
Right. Yeah. And we all remember those really, really long polling lines on college campuses in California, in Southern California in particular, where they had closed a number of polling sites. And so when we reduce polling sites in highly populated areas, that presents a barrier to access. Not everybody has hours to wait in line in order to vote.
Right.
So Ashley, did you want to add anything about the current situation in terms of voting access and voter suppression?
Yeah. I mean, I think Amanda covered a lot as far as access and people being able to get to polling sites and having the time to stand in line at polling sites. I think another thing that we see a lot is a lot of people don't know that you don't have to show ID when you go to vote. And what we've seen last election, election before that, is a lot of people complaining that they were asked to show their ID and they didn't have ID, or they didn't have the correct ID. So I think like just being aware of that. And then for me, my biggest concern is like, how do we get into the most marginalized communities, or the communities most impacted by these policies, these laws, and educate them, and then make voting accessible? One of the things that I'm really worried about when we talk about early voting or voting from home is people who don't have access to be able to fill out the application for an absentee ballot and then get that absentee ballot sent to them. Like, I'm worried about how many voters are going to be missed during this time just because people don't know how to fill out that application, or just because people don't have access to internet to be able to ask for an absentee ballot, as well as people moving from different locations, and maybe the absentee ballot being sent to the wrong location. There's just so many things that's in the balance here that we have to worry about.
Yeah, Ashley, you begin to touch on a topic that I really want to drill down on. We all know that this pandemic is a terrible health crisis. We know that it's an economic crisis, but now we're seeing that it's proving to be a democracy crisis as well. We saw the first harbinger of that in the Wisconsin presidential primary, where voters were literally forced to choose between their health and, in essence, their lives, because this is a deadly virus, and their right to vote. So what steps do you think our government needs to take in order to ensure that our right to vote is protected during this pandemic?
I think if we're going to do early voting, and we're going to ask people to apply for absentee ballots, to fill out an application to get an absentee ballot, I think there needs to be mass education on it. I don't think enough people know that that is an option. And if people know, I don't think they know when the deadline is. I don't think people know how to fill out an application to get it, or where to go to fill out an application. And I'm worried that people will also think that the application is the absentee ballot. So I think just mass education needs to happen around it. I think the Board of Elections needs to be doing more to educate communities that this is happening, the steps that they need to take in order to be able to get an absentee ballot, when the due date is and when the deadline is. I think the deadline to file an application for an absentee ballot is June 16th. I think that's the deadline.
That is correct.
Enough people don't know that. I know people who are running campaigns to be elected who and their campaign team doesn't even know that. So if people who are close to the process like this doesn't know, I'm pretty sure the community at large doesn't know as well. So I'm worried about that. I'm wondering what the Board of Elections is going to do. I'm wondering what our mayor and our county executive is going to do to help educate folks about that.
Yeah, you make a really important point, because those, instead of mailing the actual ballots to our voters, I think a lot of people heard that we are going to have something sent in the mail from the Board of Elections. And what that is an application to file your absentee ballot. And because we're using this system where we're still required to give a reason to swear, that we cannot vote in person for a particular reason, you have to indicate on that application why you won't be there. And it doesn't say because of COVID-19. It doesn't say something that's that obvious. It says something along the lines, because of medical disability or illness, you will not be voting in person. And so I think I just got the numbers this morning about how many requests for absentee ballots there have been in Monroe County, and is it only in the hundreds. Wow. Now, and that is scary. That's scary, because we are only 6.5 out, 6 weeks out from a primary election, and there have only been requests where in a community where over hundreds of thousands are eligible to vote in the primary. So that's really scary. And I know that that Congress has set aside some money through the CARES Act. I think they provided $400 million to start to implement some of these changes to ensure fair elections. But it's estimated that $4 billion is needed in order to implement safe, fair elections in light of this pandemic. Iman, did you want to add?
No, I
don't want to cut you off, Ashley. Go ahead.
Why don't you go, Ashley? Go ahead with your comment.
I was going to say, with all of that information that we have, as well as we don't know if early voting is going to happen. If it does happen, where are those sites going to be? Who's going to have access to them, et cetera, et cetera. With all of that in play, I'm not sure how these elections can be fair right now.
Right.
Right.
I was just going to acknowledge as well, like right now, right, specifically in this moment right now, like voting is more of a privilege for some than it ever has been for others. I mean, we're talking strictly about voter suppression happening in communities of color. Black and brown communities are the ones who are always faced with this crisis constantly, like every election cycle, that people will do whatever they can to suppress the votes of Black and brown people. And so when we're talking about the racial disparities that we're also seeing amongst COVID, I can't even imagine how unfair this is actually going to make this election process. So by asking for an expansion on no excuse absentee ballots or something like that, or having like a plan, having a conversation with your community, and especially the community that's been historically disadvantaged when it comes to voting, is like understanding just what they have to deal with in order to make sure that we can get it. So Ashley's absolutely right. The language we use is so confusing. And for someone who hasn't even had like a pattern of voting in the past, why would they care in this moment? And so it's like, people are trying to literally survive. So if they have to choose between their public health, or if they have to choose between voting, people will choose their health and not vote. So I think like people don't know sometimes even about the fact, like people don't even know that they can request these ballots, right? Like people just have no idea. And it's because the process has been so intentionally confusing historically in order to, again, keep these people out of the system. That's exactly why 10 years ago, when these districts were drawn up, they were drawn up the way they were. They were drawn up to divide the city in a way, and I'll put the emphasis on like what Congress hasn't done for us. We have congressional leaders who haven't done this for us. They've had the opportunity to do it and have not done it. And so again, this is absolutely not new. So to ask for this money now, thanks, I guess, but it's like, again, like so late in the game when we're nearly a month and a half away from from the election. And then to think what our governor was also trying to do, whether it was to eliminate the election that was coming up next month in June, and to kind of just push off to the general election as if like this didn't matter. Again, it's just immediate like suppression and immediate pushing off of the fact that there are some people here who were really dying hard to like get to this place in June. And so why are we doing this? And to see what the judge just completely and just undone. So it's like, it's this political game. It's not about who has a right and who is not. It's more of a political game. And so I'm glad that the rule of law has kind of like played in to what we are hoping for right now. But and like Ashley said, and Robin, you've kind of touched on as well, is maybe it's a little too late, but it's not. I think pushing for these things is absolutely crucial, or otherwise we're going to continuously see these communities continuously get disadvantaged in the future.
Right. I mean, again, only 400 million when really $4 billion was suggested by the Brennan Center for Justice in order to properly educate and provide access to people to the polls it's a slap in the face. And we need to, at this point, ensure that every American who needs to and wants to vote can vote by mail-in ballot to protect their health, that every American has access to safe and sanitary polling sites, and as you mentioned earlier, accessible polling sites. I think that a lot of the polling sites that we designate in New York State do not have access for those with physical disadvantages, and that is a huge problem. We need to ensure that voter registration is available online and remotely. We saw that Monroe County Board of Elections just made the voter registration available online, but we're at a time where online access is inhibited for so many people because we do not have public libraries open. Our schools are not open. Our recreation centers are not open. A lot of the ways that communities gain access to the internet publicly are now foreclosed to them. And so even providing that voter registration online is a problem, and the registration for ballots online is not necessarily accessible. So these are all issues that need to be addressed, and we have not allocated adequate funding to address those issues.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think right now, I think my concern is like, what do we do in Monroe County? Like, how do we raise the issue in Monroe County, and how do we let the community at large know what the process is? I'm terrified that election day will come and people just won't vote.
Right.
because they don't know. People don't want to go, outside or to polling sites, and people don't know the process. So I think my question is like, how do we make people aware? How do we get people the information about the process?
Right. Yeah, and I agree with you. I mean, we are not investing enough um, in voter education, and
Mhm.
this is new for all of us. And I can't imagine in communities where it's not second nature to vote, that really are underrepresented, and um, you know how this is going to disproportionately impact those communities. So um, Im- Iman, I can't remember. Iman, you touched on this earlier. The New York State Board of Elections did attempt to cancel the presidential primary. The commissioners Kellner and Spano decided to cancel the New York State primary by virtue of a clause that was written into the New York State budget, passed by the state legislature and signed by Governor Cuomo. But in a lawsuit that proceeded thereafter, Yang et alia versus the New York State Board of Elections, that decision to cancel the primary on June 23rd, the presidential primary on June 23rd, was overturned by federal court judge Torres. Did the NYCLU take an official position on that decision, whether to cancel the primary or in the ensuing lawsuit?
We would we didn't we have no formal involvement with any of the litigation that happened, but as far as just public response goes, of course we would never support the cancellation of a primary. Again, it's really about one's rights, and the last thing that we want to do, especially in a time like this, is cancel out someone's voice when it comes to the democratic process. So we, if anything, we should have been spending more time finding ways to create alternatives to voting, not canceling the primary.
Right.
Yeah.
Ashley, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
I absolutely agree. If anything, we should have been trying to figure out alternatives to voting instead of canceling it. So I agree with mine.
Yeah. I obviously agree. I was I was definitely supportive of the lawsuit, and I was glad that the judge granted the motion for those delegates to participate in that lawsuit, and then also that the lawsuit was ultimately won by the people who wanted to proceed with the primary. I think one of the issues that came up was the lack of voter education around who would even be on that ballot. I think that we have an electoral college, and people don't actually know how that works. And
Right.
the fact that we have pledged delegates for these presidential primary candidates who are on the ballot as well as the presidential candidates themselves. And so it was not just about electing either Biden or Yang or Sanders. This was also about electing the delegates, the pledged delegates to those candidates. And the only mechanism that we have had to select those delegates is by vote. And by canceling the presidential and primary, we basically created a situation where those delegates would not be democratically elected, and there was no process put in place for their selection by any other means. So it was probably going to be some kind of backroom deal. And so these were issues of democracy that were severely threatened, and in the blink of an eye during a pandemic. And in order to pass a budget that has a lot of problems, we granted the decision whether or not to carry out an election to two partisan appointees. So I think that it just highlights that we have to be vigilant, that during this crisis, our democracy is not stolen from us. Do either of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just agree with you, Robin. I think, again, I before I joined the ACLU, I was strictly working on political organizing, and to see the level of, you know, the level of suppression, the level of like detail invested in like really just omitting certain neighborhoods out of certain districts, or like voting plans or whatever it was just very clear to me. And so to see that, and to have like this insider kind of club in a sphere that's actually meant to be so inclusive of everyone, is exactly why I think we saw a movement in the way that Bernie Sanders kind of led. You know, we don't necessarily take a position on any one candidate because we are nonpartisan, but I mean, there's something to say about the fact that we have a completely new audience of people, and like, you know, people who are really interested, that are not a part of the establishment, that really want to be anti-establishment, that really want to pursue that. And like, I will recognize that, Robin, you are one of those people as well. And so just acknowledging that, I think, is really important, because I think people are sick and tired of this old movement. It doesn't work. It really continuously pushes people out, and people are sick because politics is inevitably like a part of our lives. There's not a single thing that isn't political about what we have to deal with, whether it's the roads we drive on, to the doctors we see, or the doctors we don't see. I think it's really important to just recognize that these elected leaders are the ones, and the ones that we have a right to either keep in office or remove from office, have every right to help us. And so if they're choosing not to be there for us, and if they're not representing us in any way, then we have a right to be a part in the process of removing them. Again, like, I go back to the fact that there are people in office now who are interested in things that have nothing to do with this, have never once even brought this to attention. And so what do I say to them? Why would, like, of course people will backlash and want to invite themselves into this process, and there are some who would probably risk their lives in order to vote for what they need to vote on. But I hate that we have to choose between these two things right now, because it shouldn't be that. The other thing is just like, I think like the one thing that I wish people understood is just how intertwined elected officials are in our everyday lives. I think people just don't understand just how many of the decisions they make in an office do clearly trickle back down to the way we live, and especially local politics, whether it's Congress, whether it's state legislature, whether it's our governor. All of those people play it in, day out. But if you look back, I mean, there are some who have been around who like represent Black and brown voters and have never spoken to those Black and brown voters ever. And so it's like, okay, and so putting our white suburban districts ahead of the people who have been suppressed for years and centuries, and since the existence of voting, I think is just absolutely abysmal. And I think we're not in a place right now to want to just sit back and wait for that. So calling on this, and Ashley, you asked like, what can people do? One thing that I think people need to do is, if they're choosing to run for office, they need to make this a known fact. They need to make it known that this is an issue, and that is their job as people who want to become public servants, to educate all community members on what this actually means. I think if you're investing your time, and if you're investing in time, is to do exactly this. Have conversations like this one, making sure that people understand what's going on. It's also our job of the Monroe County Board of Elections. It shouldn't be that we only had voter registration pop up available to us a week or so ago. It shouldn't be that we're here having this conversation about accessible polling sites yet again, when it's been approached to them by a number of disability advocates, other advocates, people who have received improper information in the past. And like, to sit back and think that voting isn't necessarily a part of the problem right now that we need to respond to. The lack of voting is exactly why we got to the problem here in the first place. It's Absolutely. Exactly that the voter suppression is exactly why our president is sitting in this seat. It's exactly why our congressional leaders are who they are. It's exactly this. And what have they done? We shouldn't be having these conversations if things were actually working out for us. So I think they're actually failing us tremendously. And so we have every right to vote them out. We have every right to continue having this conversation, shifting the narrative, and really making sure that people's voices are accounted for. And especially now, again, census is happening. Well, I think the census is now over, but I think
still happening.
Going.
Yeah. It's still extended till August 14th as well. But again, these are things that people are not aware of.
Yeah. Even like me, somebody who's in this all the time and doing this work, I'm not even caught up on the deadlines sometimes. And I'm just like, if I'm choosing to spend this time 24/7 doing this work and I'm still not aware of it, I can't even imagine what some have to go through. So Ashley's absolutely right. Like the process and the system is intentionally confusing to get people to be discouraged by the system and kind of like push them out. But those are the communities that are always thought of last. So those are the communities that we don't necessarily get the proper funding into. And we see that in our own city. We see that in the suburbs. We see that here. But yet we constantly put our white constituents above our Black and brown constituents. It's very blunt here. The segregation, the reality of the racism that exists in politics is so blatant. And this wouldn't be an issue if it was happening in white communities, but it's because it's happening in Black communities, it's not being brought to the forefront.
Yeah, I think for me as an organizer, I'm always thinking, how do we preserve the democracy? What can we do? And Aman talked about being anti-establishment, and I don't want to get too much into politics, but when we look at people like Bernie Sanders, when we look at people like Robin, the question is how can we help? And I would just say, especially for communities that I come from, where people are so disenfranchised and disengaged because they're so overwhelmed with regular everyday life, they can't even think about voting. When I think about how can we get involved, education, political education. And let me just say, for us to be doing this, thank you so much, Robin, for inviting us to do this, but this is the work of the Board of Elections. And we have to hold them accountable to do this work. This is the work of people that are sitting in these seats who we elected to offices to represent us, and they're not doing the work to educate the people about what the process looks like. I'm terrified for this election in June, because I know deep in my gut that so many people aren't going to be voting because they don't know the process. So I would just say, for those of us who do, just make noise, put it out there, use our social media, use our, live videos to educate people, because it really seems like people aren't going to get the information that they need to get.
Thank you so much. I agree with both of you. I think that the system is, again, designed to function a certain way, and it's functioning perfectly as it was intended. It's intended to disenfranchise certain folks. It's intended to produce underrepresentation in certain communities, and that's what we see. A lot of what is legal is not moral. It's not morally correct. And we see that in terms of voting. We see that in terms of the districts that are drawn. I know that by law, towns cannot be divided among assembly districts and Senate districts, yet we have cities that can be divided and are deliberately divided. The city of Rochester has 3 New York State Senate districts. And that is ridiculous for a community of its size. Our election districts don't make sense. And we are, as Iman pointed out, in a census year where, and we're conducting a census. This is a first online census. We're conducting it in the middle of a pandemic, and communities that already are at risk for low turnout we're going to see that exacerbated by the pandemic, the lack of access to public internet, the lack of access to the community centers where we promote awareness around these issues. And just on April 1st, we had Census Day, which was supposed to be a national day of awareness, and we were all shuttered inside our homes, of course. And so, go ahead.
Can I just add to that? Now, filling out the census is important. It's dire important, because that's how we get money into our communities. But we're asking people to fill out a census during a pandemic when people don't know what they're going to eat, if they're going to have a job, looking for a job, being put out. Even though rent is stopped, people are still being put out of their apartments or their houses. So, all of those things matter. And what communities, I'm thinking about urban communities, how many people fill out the census because of whatever reason. Mm-hmm. All of those things add to poverty, add to voter suppression, add to lack. And just thinking about who are the people in these seats who we've elected who have the power to influence these policies, and what are they doing?
Right. We need to hold our representatives accountable. I think that is, and the way we do that is through voting. And so we need to recognize that if voting didn't matter, nobody would be trying to suppress your vote. So anyway, does anybody have any closing comments? We do like to keep these to around a half an hour. We've had a really engaging discussion, really passionate discussion. I knew you guys would bring the passion, and I love everything that you've said. I agree with everything that you said. So how can we close it out? How can we raise awareness, use this platform to do something?
So I do have someone in the comments when we talked about what is things that we can do to educate our community. I think Donna Harris in the comments said the Rochester Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta sorority is hosting a Facebook Live event on May 11th at 6 p.m. to discuss absentee ballot, voter registration, and ballot review. So, and if we could just promote that so that we can get people that information.
We will be promoting that. Thank you, Delta Sigma Theta, for all you do in our community. And anything else? I want to give pointers to the Monroe County Board of Elections. We'll have those on the Facebook page, and so that you can find out whether you are registered, how to register, how to obtain an absentee ballot. Part of the one of the things that we were requesting in the lawsuit against the Board of Elections was that we have actual mail-in voting, not this substitute that we're using in our absentee ballot system, but actual mail-in voting so that people do not have to expose themselves to the polls if they do not request an absentee ballot. So,
and are people having to pay for the postage to send back their application for the absentee ballot?
The postage is it will be delivered regardless whether you include postage, but there is a place for postage on the form. So it will be delivered regardless of whether you put postage on there, but there is a place for postage. Again, that is yet another problem.
Yeah. I think my only comment to close this off would just be, I don't want to talk about the right to vote as a silo opportunity. I mean, this is a part of everything that else that we're talking about right now in our communities. I know healthcare is kind of at the forefront of everything we're all trying to kind of abide by, whether it's like having proper access to healthcare, whether it's getting the right to treatment, the right to testing, whatever it may be, which does fall back right down to who's in office, who's advocating on our behalf, who's doing this. We have an election crisis in the city school district that is actually going to be voted on tonight. A budget will be voted on tonight. All of that falls back down to elections. We have all this funding that we're talking about today. Our congressional leaders are the ones who are supposed to be advocating for this. We shouldn't have to be pushing and shoving them in order to do it, and continuing to remain silent on it. So all these issues really bring us right back to why we need to vote. So again, this is going to take a long time of conversation and shifting a narrative. But I think this is also, we're here today because of a product of systemic and institutional racism, and so we're going to try to undo that. So we'll continuously move forward into hoping to undo all these damages. But our New York State legislature, when we're talking about locally, does have the opportunity to shift that right now. And so we're hoping that the governor, the legislature, as well as our congressional leaders stand by our side on that.
Thank you so much. And I do just want to highlight one other Facebook discussion that I did see going on last night. You mentioned, Iman, just how fundamental voting is to issues that we see around us, and how it is connected to everything in our democracy, everything in our society, because ultimately everything stems from voting. And we just saw on Facebook that a number of communities within Monroe County are distributing sites, for instance, and none of those sites were within the city proper. None of the sites that were being promoted were within the city proper. And again, we can trace all of this back to voting. The right of every person to vote is fundamental to our society and our democracy, and voting is literally the right that we use to exercise to protect all of our other rights. So again, that's why we're having this today. Go ahead.
And when we talk about none of those sites being in the city, we need to think about who makes that decision. What branch of our government locally makes that decision where those sites are. And then the other part I wanted to say, just so that people know, since there are no sites in the city, our mayor is working to have mass mail to everyone, as well as make up food sites as pickup sites in the city.
Right.
But back to that list that we saw last night, who made that decision for those sites? Right. And I want to say no names, but it's a county decision.
Yeah. Right. And so again, I just want to highlight that all of these things that we see, all of these issues that we see, they are tied to voting. So I want to make sure that we exercise your right to vote. make sure you're informed. We're going to have a bunch of links on this video to make sure that you can get more information about how you do exercise your right to vote. And again, be safe, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. Ashley, it's
Thank you for
always
having
a
us.
pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Vote, people.